Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Parenting is Easy podcast, where we will discuss the pleasures and the frustrations, the good and the bad, and the rewarding and the troubling aspects of parenting. I am your host, Hananya Abraham, and I'm a psychotherapist that specializes in working with teenagers, young adults, and parents with a specific niche in assisting with communication within the family dynamics. While everyone has their own unique journey and experiences as a parent and as a child, there are many common affiliations and attributes that we can all relate to and share. Together, we will learn from personal stories and experiences from parents across many different backgrounds, cultures, and communities. So get comfortable, grab your glass of coffee, and let's get right into the interview. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Parenting is Easy, said no one ever. We've had a lot of guests and a lot of different topics talking about different areas of parenting. And today, helping us deal with another area of parenting and another type of stress is Douglas Mulholland. Hopefully I'm saying that name correctly.
You are, indeed.
Okay. Douglas has founded the first biotech company to restore the elastic in arteries, the first water recycling institute in Brazil, and the most watched TV network in Ukraine. His career covers journalism, filmmaking, podcasting, the scientific institute management, executive training. All of these are linked to his focus on health. And specifically today, we're going to be talking about the toxic metals that American Heart Association and the World Heart Federation have newly declared as a major heart disease risk at every age, and hopefully also touching on specifically our children's IQ. Doug, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks very much for having me. This is a really important topic for parents and kids and parents who are kids of parents. So basically, everyone who's watching this is going to gain something from it for sure.
Okay, awesome. So can you give us a little bit of a background? I know, there's a lot of TV production and stuff like that, but specifically regarding this topic of these metals, where has your work started and how did you get into this?
I'm going to answer that by first saying that human beings have this really funny trait, all of us, including myself, and that is that if nasty things go on long enough, you get used to it. And actually, that's the problem that human beings have been facing ever since humans began to walk the earth, because we've gotten used to the idea that our bodies start to fall apart at around the age of 30, and then we get worse as time goes on and we eventually die. And we've also gotten used to the fact that the majority of us die of cardiovascular disease. These have become more or less accepted, and my argument is this is unacceptable and not necessary anymore, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, I am specialized in the area of working with designers to keep toxic metals away from people by redesigning the way we make things, including consumer products and the buildings where people spend 85% of their time. And this is especially important for parents and their kids, because the biggest epigenetic impacts, that is, that environmental impacts on how your genes behave, occur in the early years of life. And we learned this through the work at our institute, where our scientists actually specialize in these toxic metals. So we have one of the first and most recognized certifications for healthy products and buildings by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. So the US EPA has recognized the certification. We developed it actually in the 1990s. And today it is used worldwide. So I would say that, we are some of the leaders in this field. And so I came at this actually from a different direction than the medical side. I came at it from the direction of healthy products. And through that, I actually began to realize that a lot of the toxic impacts of these metals, and I'm just going to take a second to explain what we're talking about when I say heavy metals. So toxic metals, a lot of them are called heavy metals for the simple reason that they're 5 times heavier, more dense than water. That's the scientific definition, and you don't have to worry about it. What you have to worry about is what they are, and that is things like lead, cadmium, and arsenic, all of which are endemic in our environment, and as you just mentioned at the top of the show, have been identified by the American Heart Association as being major new causes of heart disease at low levels of exposure that everyone on the planet is exposed to. And this goes a long way to explaining why, ever since humans started to walk the earth, we have been falling apart, because our bodies have been actually accumulating these metals. And in the past few hundred years of the Industrial Revolution, it's gotten worse because we've gotten a lot better at using these metals in our products. So this came home to me personally because my father died of heart disease, and heart disease doesn't run in our family. It kind of gallops. So I realized that I was a candidate for this, and I really started exploring what were some of the core causes of heart disease. And I began to understand that when a lot of people get heart attacks, they don't meet the normal risk factors. They don't drink, they don't smoke, they exercise, they're not overweight, and they still get heart attacks. And what was causing that? Well, the American Heart Association has just answered that question. And this starts at birth, which is why it's so important for parents and their kids. So that's a little introduction to how I personally and professionally became involved in this area. And I think that those two combination of that personal experience and the professional background has given me a somewhat unique perspective. And that's why I wrote the book, because I couldn't find any other book that actually covered this territory.
And that book is titled again?
Discovering the Nature of Longevity, Restoring the Heart and Body by Targeting Hidden Stress. And these metals are part, but not all, of that hidden stress that we don't smell, we can't feel, and we don't notice until it starts to make us sick. And that's why I call it hidden stress.
Got it. Okay. So, and obviously to everyone listening, if you're interested in purchasing the book, we will have a link in the description to the podcast. But there are a few things over there, Doug, that I really want to unpack. First of all, just hearing the personal connection that you have to this topic, obviously, I think has motivated you and really given you that energy to do this work that you've been doing over the past couple of decades. And specifically regarding children aspect of things, when we talk about it starting in infancy, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what parents can do when moms are pregnant and they are taking in nutrition. They might be taking some multivitamins. What should they be looking out for, and what should they be staying away from?
Right. Well, there is some good news here, and that is that your kids, the infant and in the womb, the body in the womb, has actually a self-defense mechanism against these heavy metals, which is good news, right? And that is that their liver actually doesn't work until well after they're born. And the result of that is that any contamination, like with these toxic metals, that is passed through the placenta to the child in the womb, and then in their very early months when they're breastfeeding, goes straight out the other end. So that, this is really interesting that the human body has sort of evolved this defense mechanism in very early life. So that's fine. And I'm not saying that, of course, mothers should pollute their bodies, because the general health of the mother has a huge impact on the health of the child. And so if the mother is full of these heavy metals, she's definitely going to have a problem. And there are lots of ways that mothers can protect themselves from these metals. The first one, just right off the bat, is to improve the air quality in their home and where they work and in their car. And there's a really easy way to do that, and that is to switch out the filters in your air conditioning systems and your furnaces to get a higher quality filter that filters out more of these particulates. These particulates, which you breathe in the millions every time you breathe, just let me say that again, are actually, they have heavy metals tied onto them. And that's because air pollution from all of these sources contains these heavy metals. So really simple thing that you can do, quite affordable. improve the air quality where you're living. People spend 85% of their time indoors, in their cars, in their homes, in their offices. So that's a really effective way. The second way, likewise, is with your drinking water, and that is attach a heavy metal filter to your tap, and make sure that it is certified as taking out these heavy metals like lead, arsenic, and cadmium, because a lot of filters don't do that. And by the way, bottled water doesn't guarantee it either. And for example, if you heat up some of the plastics that contain that have bottled water plastics or soft drinks plastics, guess what happens? Especially with soft drinks, they leach the heavy metals, which are used as preservatives and antioxidants in the plastic, and it leaches into the water and the soft drinks. So that's not great. So drinking water out of plastic bottles isn't going to help you very much either. The best way is to really put this filter on your tap. So those are two really easy things that you can do. It's a tremendous investment in the mother's health and the child's health. And also, of course, in the foods that you eat, there's a lot of things that you can do. The very first thing, I have to say this, although I'm not religious about it, but I have been doing this for the past 7 years. Go organic and plant-based for the simple reason that most animals are not raised under organic conditions. And even if they are, they're still exposed to a lot of heavy metals and in their feed and just under the conditions in which they're kept. And the real problem with that is that they serve to bioaccumulate the heavy metals before they ever get to you. So when you're eating the meat from these animals, it doesn't matter if it's a chicken or a cow, they have already bioaccumulated these metals. And so they got a head start on you, and that gives your body a head start on accumulating these. So not really a great idea. And fish is pretty similar with things like mercury. Now, I'm like I say, I'm not religious about it. I eat fish, a couple of times a month, but that's one way to reduce your exposure for sure. And there's tons and tons of books out there about the advantages of a plant-based diet that I'm not going to recite here. I'm sure a lot of mothers know about this already. So all of those things mothers can do right now, and it doesn't cost a lot of money. And by the way, a plant-based diet costs less than a flesh-based diet normally. So there you go. Those are quick and easy things that people can do, and then we can go from there.
So I just want to unpack that a little bit more. So I want to go back to both the water filters and also the air conditioning filters. What should we be looking out for? Like, are there specific companies or certain letterings on these filters or on these water filters?
Good point. I'm glad you brought that up. That's one thing I forgot to say. So if you go to the US EPA website or Consumer Reports, you'll get reports on both air and water filters. And so they will rank them. It's a really easy thing to do. So and by the way, the certification that's done by our institute is called the Cradle to Cradle certification. And it's an independent certification. We don't certify ourselves. It's done by an independent nonprofit institute, actually based in San Francisco, called the Cradle to Cradle Products and Innovation Institute. So look at the US EPA websites, look at the certifications. There's a lot of greenwashing out there, so you've got to be really careful about the certifications that you look at. So those are easy ways to find that out. And before I forget, and I'm so glad that you reminded me, just talking about toxins in food, the state of California has just passed a new legislation requiring baby food companies to declare the amount of heavy metals that are in baby food. And you got to ask yourself, why would they do that? You mean there's heavy metals in baby food? Oh yeah, big time. So for the past 5 years, congressional committees and Consumer Reports have each independently verified that popular baby foods are contaminated with unacceptably high levels of these heavy metals, if you can believe it. And they've done 2 sets of tests, one 5 years ago and one this year, and they found pretty similar results, minor improvements, but also getting worse in some other categories.
So what should parents be looking out for, and how can they?
Parents should be looking for brands of baby foods that certify that they have extremely low or no levels of heavy metals. And you can find those by looking at heavy metals free baby foods. You just Google it, and some of these brands will come up. So this is really, really important, because obviously you don't want those heavy metals starting to accumulate in your children. As someone once said, unless you live on an island in the sky, there's no way to fully protect yourself and your kids from these metals. But there are lots of ways to really limit those metals getting into you. And as we'll talk about a little later in the show, there are methods to get them out of you once they do get into you.
Okay, so before
California is the first state in the United States to do this, and that information is going to become public as of January 1st, 2025. And in 2024, they're going to have to declare it to the health authorities. So this is nothing but good news.
It's amazing. And hopefully more states will follow suit. I just want to go back to one more thing over here regarding the filters before we go back to what you were talking about regarding food.
Sure.
So let's say someone's listening to this podcast right now and they're headed to Lowe's or Home Depot and they're going to buy filters. So and they're not going to go check consumer reports. I'm curious if there's certain lettering or certain ratings they should be looking for in filters or in their water purifiers that people should be looking for when they're going to be buying this stuff.
Well, first of all, for air quality, ask your local air conditioner service company. So just ask them, say, what is the best filter that I can get for that unit that is going to keep these small particles out of them, in plain language, please. The second thing is, if you go to Home Depot, for example, ask the salesperson, and this will also test their knowledge, if they have any HEPA filters, HEPA. So that's just a very high level filter that, for example, hospitals use to keep a lot of the pathogens out, and they also keep a lot of these particles contain both pathogens and heavy metals. And when I say pathogens, I mean things like harmful bacteria, harmful viruses, etc. So that's a really good thing to do. And before I forget, there are some other things that you can do, really simple things like take off your shoes when you come into the house because you're tracking in all of this dust. And in schools, this is a real problem. That's why so many kids get asthma attacks when everybody comes into and leaves the classroom. There have been studies done on this because they're stirring up all the dust on the floors. And so if you take off your shoes when you're coming into the house, you're going to eliminate a big source of this dust. Also, with all the wildfires going on, amazingly enough, I don't know why, but some of the websites have advised that when you get back to your home after a wildfire, open up the windows to air out the house. A bigger mistake could not be made because these wildfires burn up homes, cars, all kinds of structures, and there is a lot of ash around that contains very high levels of these heavy metals. You don't want your kids breathing that ash in. And so if you have a wind blowing and you're airing out your house, guess what's happening? That ash is coming into the house. So don't do that. The first thing you should do is change out all of the filters in your house and then turn on your system and clean the house from the inside instead of trying to clean it from the outside. And today, I just mentioned that because there's so many areas that have been exposed to wildfires where people just, simply aren't used to it.
Wow. Okay. So there's so much more there I would love to get into, but I think it's important to get to what the effects this actually has on the body and also what we can do. But before we get to those things, I just want to go in a little bit deeper in shopping for food. And we talk about shopping organic. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What parents can do, what they should be looking out for, and what should they be putting on their list as their staples when it comes to what they're shopping for their home?
Sure. So just to reiterate, if you start with the plant-based diet, you're going to be way ahead. And I want to emphasize, I've been on a plant-based diet for, like I said, for 7 years. the stuff that's available on the market today is so much better than it was 5 years ago. So if people say, oh, it's so bland and I miss my dairy products and stuff like this, look again, because there's so many dairy substitutes out there now. They're really great and they taste great. And so anyone who tried this a couple of years ago or hears the rumors that, well, it's simply not true. I don't miss meat at all. I have to tell you that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is natural doesn't mean anything. Just to be clear, okay? You need to look at the certifications for organic food and make sure that you have a very, very high level of certification. Fair trade also does not mean that you have an organic product that has low levels of these toxins. So all of these words that are getting thrown around, you've got to be really careful about it. And the best way to do that is to look at the organic certifications and to make sure that the organic certifications are recognized by Consumer Reports and the Environmental Protection Agency as being very high quality certifications, because there is so much greenwashing out there, especially around the term natural foods. Just throw natural, out the window, because it doesn't really mean anything in today's marketplace. In fact, it's gotten so bad that the European Union has just introduced legislation to punish companies that are greenwashing these terms like natural. And so that's going to change things. But there's nothing like that happening in the U.S. right now, except, of course, with what the state of California has done with these baby foods. So when you're shopping, look for plant-based foods, look for organic labels. And there's one other thing you can look for. There are certain foods, and you won't see this on any of the labels, that actually get these metals out of you. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting because over time, the body has, over these millions of years where we've evolved, the body has evolved a certain capacity to get rid of these metals itself with enzymes that are actually produced in your gut. And the problem is that it can't deal with all of them because it bioaccumulates, it hides in the tissue, and it's really difficult for the body to deal with it all, which is why even before the Industrial Revolution, the evidence from human remains of 5,000 years ago show that they had been exposed to these toxins and actually developed heart disease at a very young age. So this is not new. This stuff has been in our environment for a long time. So we're actually one of the first generations to have figured out that this is really a serious problem. So having said that, there are some foods and I'll just give you one example, broccoli sprouts, not the big broccoli, although they're helpful, but broccoli sprouts, the little sprouts that you can actually grow in your kitchen. They're a little tricky, according to my wife, to grow, but you can also buy them and buy the organic ones. They are up to 100 times more effective at actually grabbing these heavy metals and taking them out of your body. What happens is you pee them out. And so this is called natural chelation. The term chelation is a Greek term for claw to grab. So basically what happens is some of these foods help your body chemically grab these metals from your tissue, and then you pee it out. And so that's one of the foods you can look for. You can also look for certain spices like curcumin, which is also very good at chelating this. So those are some of the foods that you can actually look for in the store.
That's amazing. And hopefully parents are starting to just have the awareness of what they are buying, to what they're bringing into their houses and how that's affecting them. And I don't want to get into a shopping list over here, but just could you touch one more time and just a little bit deeper? We talk about having specific certifications. What should we be looking out for, and what labels are a gimmick? Besides for just the concept of natural, I think sometimes, at least here in America, and I know there've been documentaries talking about this, of words that are used, zero trans fat, for their, I guess, to entice us to buy more items. So what is there that we can?
That's a really good point that you brought up. So the example is exactly what you just said. Getting to zero, free of. Okay. Well, free of actually doesn't mean anything. It's like I'm having a meal that is free of chicken. What does that tell me about the meal? It doesn't tell me anything about the meal except that, it doesn't have chicken in it. But it doesn't tell me about any of the other possible 100,000 foods that I'm going to have for dinner. This is exactly the problem with this advertising about free of, because it's the flavor of the month. Free, that was identified as a problem. Now it's free of this. Now it's free of that. So you need a much more comprehensive approach to the healthiness of these foods. So what you want to look at is certifications that address the overall production and processing of those foods, not focused on one or two specific things. That's really important. Now, don't take my word for it. I'm not the world's expert on all these certifications, and I do have a bit of a prejudice because we have our certification for healthy products. So what I would do, again, is I would read consumer reports and I would read the US EPA sites on certified organic products and what are the highest ranked certifications for those. There's actually quite a good choice out there. The other thing that I would just recommend, and I know that this is a problem for moms who don't have a lot of time, but a lot of studies have also shown that making stuff from scratch, eating fewer processed foods, is not that much more time consuming than buying these highly processed foods. The more highly processed the food is, usually the less nutritious it's going to be, and the higher is the likelihood that more contaminants are going to get into it.
Yeah, and I think it's important for people to realize there's a difference between nutritious and tasty, and a lot of items are tasty, but they are not necessarily nutritious. So to be mindful.
No, it's the other way around. Actually, our food has all the food that's bad for us has been developed to be tasty.
Right. Yeah, and 100%. And I'm drawing a blank right now to the one or two documentaries that I've seen talking about this concept, and maybe very
like sugar and salt.
Yes.
I mean, sugar and salt they're in all of our foods. Cornstarch. So there's certain basics that have been out there. You don't need to read very far to understand that tasty can mean the opposite of nutritious pretty fast.
Yeah.
And often does.
So I want to move into the direction here of talking more about the consequences and even the effects on early child development when we talk about these toxics in the body. So what are some of the toxic metals that can and have a everlasting, or hopefully not everlasting, physical and even cognitive development issues within our children?
Sure. And let's talk about the difference between useful trace metals and toxic metals. So there are some useful trace metals that a lot of mothers have heard about, and they take supplements for them. For example, zinc, copper, so there are these trace metals, but you need to understand one very important thing. Very, very small traces, like parts per billion that we're talking about, that cells actually need to do their function. And if you get too many of them, you're going to have a toxicity issue. And we're not talking about those metals anyways. What we're talking about is heavy metals that have no business in your body and no function for cells except to injure them and destroy them. So the top three, and the reason I keep focusing on the top three is because the science in cardiovascular disease, in cancer, and in neurology has focused on lead, cadmium, and arsenic. And these are the metals that have been identified in the American Heart Association special statement as being heart disease risks at very low levels. And, the reason I know so much about this is because the chairman of cardiology at Columbia University, Dr. Gervasio Lamas, actually wrote the foreword to my book, and he is the author of the American Heart Association statement. So we've had long talks about this over the years, and he has almost single-handedly brought into public awareness, along with the American Heart Association, what is going on with low levels of these metals. And to be clear, this is not metal poisoning. So most healthcare providers are taught to look for metal poisoning that is a whole different level, where that is exponentially more metals than we're talking about. So the problem is that that's what they're testing for. They're testing your blood if they suspect metal poisoning for the levels of lead and cadmium and arsenic in your blood. That is not where these low levels are. They're in your tissue, of course. That's where they lodge. And to answer your first question about what are the impacts, when they lodge in your tissue, they do a couple of very nasty things. The first thing they do is that they disrupt your DNA. So they are chemically toxic to DNA, and so they cause mutations. And those mutations can lead to two things. One is cancer, and the other thing is a chronic inflammatory response, because when this starts happening to your cells, they send out an alarm bell. And that alarm bell creates inflammation because it's part of the immune response. And because this stuff builds up in your body, that response becomes chronic and your immune system turns against you. Now, here's what happens when your immune system turns against you. I'm just going to put this up. Have I got that right on the camera? Okay, so on this side here, where for people who are listening, I've got two images up here of elastic fiber in your arteries. And this is also the stuff that keeps your skin flexible and your organs flexible. And every breath you take and every move you make depends on it. It's called elastic fiber or elastin fiber.
Move it back a little bit so we can see a little better. Here, there we go. Yeah, that's good.
How's that? Okay. So this stuff here is in a 6-year-old, nice and smooth. You can see how wonderful that stuff is. On the other side here is a mess, right? And that is in a 90-year-old. This is happening in all of us. And one of the reasons for that is because of these hidden stresses that chew away at the lining on this elastic fiber. So when that happens and the lining is breached, as it is in your arteries, in your brain, and in your organs, they all send out a cry for help, and the body responds with chronic inflammation, which is why we all actually develop a chronic inflammatory condition as we get older. And that flies below the radar, but it manifests itself as hardening of the arteries, which eventually we all die of. And you remember at the top of the show, I said how we've all gotten used to these horrible things that happen to us. And that's a beautiful example of that, is we've gotten used to the fact that we start to sag and our arteries start to harden. And there's not much you can really do about that because that's just the way things work. No, actually, what is going on here is that we've recognized that nature is not always our friend. And in this case, especially not, because it has developed these heavy metals that are not good for us at all. And so there you have it. These impacts are causing our skin to sag and our arteries to harden and carcinogenic cells to form. And they interfere with neurological function because, what happens when you take a wire and put it across two live wires? You get a short circuit. What do you think is happening with these heavy metals in our brain with neurons?
Doing the same.
That's exactly what's happening. They're short-circuiting our neuronal signals, which starts to explain a lot about why we have these chronic issues as we get older. And so on all three levels, whether it's neurological or carcinogenic or cardiology, this stuff is bad news, and we have to stop it from getting into us, and we have to start getting rid of it. And the next thing we could possibly talk about is the therapies that are available.
But before we get to the therapies, I want to go back to something we started off with as well, talking about the effects this can have on a child's IQ. Can you talk a little bit about where that comes from?
Sure.
And the preventative measures that parents can take?
Yeah. So 6 weeks ago, the highly recognized clinical journal for people who aren't in the medical field is The Lancet. The Lancet is recognized as really one of the top clinical journals, and they published a study that concluded that the impacts of low levels of lead on children's IQ and on deaths in heart disease have been grossly, I emphasize this word, grossly understated, to the extent that lead, in terms of fatalities in heart disease, is ahead of smoking and cholesterol. Now, just think about that for a second. So the second thing is, it has been responsible for an average decline in children's IQ of several points globally. So this is a real problem. And the reason that it affects the IQ is what I said before, is when you have lead lodging in the blood vessels that feed the brain and in the neurons that are trying to communicate with each other, of course this is going to affect IQ. So once again, we've gotten used to this, but we don't have to. And the reason I keep chipping away at that, getting used to awful things, is because everyone who's listening to this show should really take action. And we'll talk about that a little later. But the first step to that is educating yourself. And then the second step is actually taking action and saying, no, I'm mad as heck, and I'm not going to take it anymore. And just because it's been happening for the past few million years doesn't mean it has to continue happening.
And I think a lot of what you're saying is new, at least to me, and something that I'll obviously be taking into consideration when I'm shopping and with the products that I'm buying. And I think just
that was
the
new to me too.
of all of this, I think is a real eye opener. As you're talking, though, there's one thing one question that's, I don't want to say bothering me, but just sort of like on my mind. We talk about the toxicity that's within the system, and therefore how that can have a long-term effect within the body, cognitively, developmentally, neurobiologically as well. At the same time, when you're going back from the Industrial Revolution till now, the average age for both men and women have gone up exponentially. So how does that come into play regarding age being more and us being able to live longer lives, but at the same time having to be on the more preventative care aspect of things and seeing the dangers of things?
Sure. So first of all, we haven't beat the 120-year ceiling on longevity ever, and we haven't gotten any closer to doing it, which is interesting. So even though average life expectancy has improved, and I'll just get into that in a moment, we haven't broken through this longevity ceiling, even though it's quite clear from all the studies that the human body is capable of going on for a lot longer than it does. It's not programmed, as some people have suggested, to discombobulate around the age of 100 or whatever. It just simply is not. It has the capacities. But if it's mortally wounded as it goes through the life process, then of course it's going to conk out. And the main thing that happens, like I said before, is we all turn to stone, like Queen Elizabeth, she died of hardening of the arteries. So old people, very long-lived people die, they turn to stone and then creak to a halt. That's what happens with the oldest and healthiest living people. So to be clear, average life expectancy is increasing, but the ceiling is not increasing along with it. So that's number one. Number two, the reason that average life expectancy has increased so dramatically over the past couple of 100 years is due to a couple of very simple things. One of them is sanitation and washing your hands.
Disease.
So that has helped us get rid of a whole lot of communicable diseases that used to wipe out so many children before the age of 10, which contributed to keeping that life expectancy very low. So that's number one, is sanitation has been the biggest single factor. A close second has been vaccinations for childhood diseases. Regardless of all the controversy around vaccinations, the numbers are quite clear on the dramatic improvement and the reduction in these chronic children's diseases. So there's just no question about it that vaccines in this area, despite the drawbacks that people have pointed out, all in all, the risk versus reward has been pretty clear in that particular department. So yes, there's always risks. So that's number two. And number three was the advent of antibiotics. But that is now starting to backfire because, as everybody knows, the overuse of antibiotics has led to antibiotic strains, antibiotic-resistant strains that are now listed by the world's top 17 health ministers globally as the leading threat to human civilization. So that little number has come around to smack us. So, but those three things have really led to this longevity. Having said that, as we're living longer, then the heavy metals start to come into play because they bioaccumulate as you get older. So when you have done these three things with sanitation and vaccination and antibiotics that have gotten rid of a lot of these other things, the metals are still there. And so they come into play, and those are the things that have been contributing to limiting this. And we might be living older, but we're also living a lot sicker, and we're requiring a hugely expensive healthcare regime, which is collapsing under the weight of this. And the reason it's collapsing is because of these hidden stresses that are coming in to play. And we have asked our healthcare system over the past 75 years to keep us going. That's the thing. So that's what they did. They didn't cure much, but they sure kept us going. But now that keeping us going isn't working anymore as we're all, getting older. So that's a huge problem. And the system is collapsing. And, COVID exposed that quite clearly.
Pardon the pun.
So that's the problem. Our healthcare system is collapsing under the weight. Anyone who's tried to get into an emergency room or find a doctor and not pay through the nose for it absolutely knows this. So it is certainly a myth that simply because average life expectancy has increased that we have lifted the ceiling on longevity. We certainly have not, and we're living older and we're living sicker, and that cost of doing that is bankrupting healthcare. And in the United States now, we are seeing actually a reduction, not an increase, a reduction in average longevity. So the cycle is actually starting to reverse itself. So people who have the idea that this is continuing to go up and up, that's not happening in the US anymore. It's actually beginning to drop. So, a lot of this is due to this toxic buildup of these metals that has been below the radar. And I want to emphasize, most standard testing doesn't find it. You can do a blood test and it'll turn out as within acceptable ranges. When the light went on was actually in 2017 after a series of multi-million-dollar clinical trials sponsored by the National Institutes of Health. A clinical study was done on patients that were severely ill with heart disease known as peripheral artery disease, which involves the blockage of the arteries going to your limbs. And it results in having to replace the arteries at high cost and very painful, or cut the limb off. There's 200,000 amputations a year because of this. So patients who were facing this at Mount Sinai Medical Center in Miami were given this infusion, which is known as chelation therapy, which had been poo-pooed by the medical community forever and ever, but had then been proven safe in a $35 million clinical trial sponsored by the NIH. They decided to try it with these heart patients. Well, guess what happened? They didn't have amputations. They got better, and they were walking around on 2 feet 40 weeks later. 40 weeks later, they were walking around on pink feet. Their lesions had healed. Now, why is this important? Because as they got better, large amounts of lead, cadmium, chromium, and a soup of heavy metals came out of them. And as the amount declined because it was being washed out of their bodies, the patients got better. This was the burning bush. So then we had 100 years of studies showing that heavy metals trigger heart disease, trigger cancer. But on this side, we finally had clinical proof that these people got better when the metals were taken out of them. Now, that was in 2017. Have you heard of that? No. The reason that you haven't heard of it, according to the cardiologist who conducted the study, is because this therapy is inexpensive, doesn't make profit for big pharma. The healthcare community is not trained in how to recognize or treat it, according to the American Heart Association. So those three things together make a perfect storm of ignorance. And that is why most people have not heard of them. Now, if a drug company had those kinds of results with its patients, you would hear about it on the front page of every newspaper and every TV station around the world. You're not hearing it here because it's not profitable and the medical establishment is not trained for it. There are doctors who are trained, integrative cardiologists, and they know how to perform the tests that find this stuff. And that those tests are available in every state almost across the United States. So it is there. It's in plain sight. And that's why I wrote the book, was to make people aware of these choices.
Are there specific questions that we could be asking our primary care doctor to get tested for either ourselves or for our children? And if not, are there places that we can go in our states around America, maybe around the world, that we can get testing like this done for ourselves?
Right. So I'll explain how you can test for this stuff. It's actually the therapy, but it's the therapy done on the very short term. So what happens is, and I just want to explain a little bit about what chelation therapy is so people understand it. It's a combination of a chemical that chelates the metals, as I described earlier, that foods do and your body does naturally. It grabs the metals and then you pee them out. On this side are high doses of multivitamins and minerals that make sure that your body is not depleted of those, and they have a synergistic benefit along with the chelation for restoring the health, for example, of your arteries. So those things together are the chelation therapy that was used. You got to be careful when you use the word chelation because it means different things to different people. So you have to look at what was done in the clinical trials. Now, in the short run, if you do that, you do like a 1-hour test. It's an infusion that they do through a needle. And then you pee out the results. And that's where they can actually find the true levels of metals that are in your tissue. And, you'll also hear a lot of conventional healthcare providers saying, oh, these tests aren't reliable, et cetera, et cetera. No, you need to look at the results, the published results of the clinical studies on this to understand that. And a lot of the healthcare providers, because they're not trained in it, say, no. So that's why, they're a little bit out of date. So yes, these are available from naturopathic doctors, integrative physicians. Those are physicians that look at the whole health of the patient instead of just this disease or that disease. So that's called integrative medicine. And they're also available from nurse practitioners. So those sources are out there, and they follow a protocol that is dictated by a national association. And I just want to emphasize, if you as a patient go to your healthcare provider and ask about this, you will get, chances are, the same answer that the doctors who actually performed the original clinical trial gave to their patients before they did this trial. And that is, no, it doesn't work and it's probably dangerous. So to be clear, the clinical trial that was done of chelation, funded by the National Institutes of Health, was done to prove that chelation did not work. And no one was more surprised when they unblinded this gold standard study and found, for example, that in diabetic heart patients, all causes of death, all causes, not just from heart disease, were reduced by 41%. Drug companies would salivate over that kind of result. So those are the kinds of results that patients can take to their physicians and say, well, what about this? And why are we not being told about this, at least given the option to study it, instead of just simply not being told? And that's the big problem right now. The big problem is that patients are not being told, and as a result, they need to demand. And that's the message in my book.
Something that we're hopefully bringing to our listeners here, of being able to have an awareness about it. As you know, there's so many things for us to talk about, Doug. And as we're sort of wrapping it up over here, I want you to touch it for like a minute or two, specifically on the preventative measures that parents can do. What steps can we do at home to reduce our child's risk of exposure to these toxic metals in our everyday lives?
Yeah, let's summarize it. First of all, educate yourself. I have to say this, get the book, because that's why I wrote it. So you can educate yourself about what these hidden stresses do to you and what's being done to get them out of you. Second, so inform yourself. And don't just use my book. You can use other sources as well, for sure. I've got 700 scientific references in the book. You can look them up. The second thing is improve the air quality in your home. The third thing is improve the water quality by getting the right filters. The next thing you can do is to improve the quality of your food by getting certified organic products and staying away as much as possible from processed foods and meat. So those are things that you can do at home. I want to emphasize something right now. I am not a physician. That's why I asked Dr. Lamas, who is the chairman of cardiology at Columbia University, to write the foreword to my book, so that people could see that there's some credibility to this. So I don't recommend treatments to people. I just say, here's the information about what's being done. You need to make up your own mind with your health care provider. So I want to emphasize that. So these are all really simple things that people can do. Most of them don't require going to a doctor or having a prescription. They're just common sense things. Keep your air clean, your water clean, and the stuff that you eat clean. And there are ways that you can do that, as we talked about here today. And I'm so grateful to you for having the courage to bring up this topic and educate parents about what is it that they can do. And the other thing I want to emphasize is parents can do this for their kids, but also for their own parents. So it goes both ways. That's the important thing. Every parent is a child. And our parents are living longer. So we can help our parents stay healthier longer by doing this as well. That's a very good point.
Thank you for bringing that up. So as we finish up over here, I'm curious, ask a few, let's call it lightning round questions over here. As you've gone about this research and you've obviously been doing this for a long time, has there been one either funny, embarrassing, or maybe hysterical story that you've had either as a parent or at being parented when it comes to whether it's food or how to have conversations with parents?
Well, the funniness about all of it is, I think, sorry to say this, but it's the absurdity of how obvious some of these things are for people to do. It's comically tragic because, it's so clear what we can do right now to prevent this stuff. But I really think that the funniest thing I ever heard was the first time that I learned that the doctors who did this clinical trial with the NIH actually did it to convince everyone that the stuff didn't work.
Yeah.
I mean, it was amazing. And when they announced the results to the annual meeting of one of the leading heart associations in the world, the doctor told me, he said, you could hear a pin drop because they all realized this was not what they were looking for. This was like, holy crap. And yet today you still see this embedded resistance. So, I mean, you have to take it with a bit of a grain of salt when you hear that. But I think that's the funniest thing, is how very smart people are still behaving in a very silly way when, we can have a massive positive impact on so many people's lives by just, looking in a bit of a different direction. As I've always said, you don't
Yes.
find what you're not
Well,
looking
unless
for.
it's these people in the study that are looking for something specific and they get completely dumbfounded by the results, which anyone that's in any sort of research knows that, there is a lot of bias when it comes to a lot of research that's done. But yet when you have something that is completely put on your head,
Oh,
it really, it really has a real impact on you. I'm curious, you've talked about,
I do have,
your book and you talk about some other books as well. Is there one specifically that you would recommend to parents that they can get more educated on, I guess, what they're bringing into their homes and how to lead healthier lifestyles?
You caught me a bit unawares there, but what I will say is I cite a lot of those books on my website, but I would say that Caldwell Esselstyn, who was the guy that introduced the plant-based diet to reversing the effects of heart disease, it's still on the bestseller list. I feature him in my book. It's a great book. I would definitely recommend reading all of his books and his wife's books. And she has got some great cookbooks out there. So there's a whole series of books that are written by them. There are also books by You, the Owner's Manual, Dr. Roizen. There's so many of these great books out there. Dr. Jim Roberts has written a wonderful series of books on heart disease and on the impacts of toxins. So those are some examples that you can go to. So Dr. Roizen, Dr. Roberts, and especially Dr. Esselstyn, I would highly recommend doing this stuff. And just to finish off with maybe the funniest story of all, the way that heart disease gets started was actually not discovered until very recently. And the reason for that is because the tiny little particles in our body that are actually used by the body to cause chronic inflammation, they're called exosomes. They were always thought to actually contain cellular garbage from cells, and they were always thought to be used by cells simply to release things, into the body as soon as they got out of the cell. Well, the reason for that was because the way that they tracked these little blobs of fat was they dyed them with an orange dye, and then they checked them with an electron microscope. Well, one day, one of the scientists discovered that every time you change the aperture on the electron microscope, it let out a burst of light that exploded the vesicles. And that was why for 20 years, everyone thought that these vesicles were just releasing stuff into the body willy-nilly, when in fact, they're highly programmed and they were going off to other cells to deliver the stuff that prevents and causes heart disease. So we were blowing up all of these exosomes by observing them. So this is a classic case of where the act of observing actually
which
changed
is actually a very good
that is the
lesson
topic
for us parents regarding how we're supposed to be going about working with our kids over here as well.
Exactly. So that's the topic of a whole other thing. We haven't talked about this elastic fiber or these exosomes.
Well, hopefully we'll have another opportunity
or a lot of the other
because there are
things
so many things
that are in the book
for us to talk about. But one last question for you as we sort of wrap up over here. If you can think of one mundane, regular superpower that you would like to have as a parent to assist with everyday parenting responsibilities, what would that be?
This is going to sound weird. Understanding how AI is going to impact our children. To me, that's the biggest single superpower that I would love to have, because the impacts of AI on our children, on our civilization, on medicine, and on healthcare, and on everything else we do is going so fast. I wrote about this in an earlier book 20 years ago called Our Molecular Future, and I predicted what's happening right now today. That is by far the most important superpower
Something that you would
we
like
could
to
all
have.
have. And if we don't get it,
That's amazing.
and that I would like to have, because it's going to have it itself. And so this is something that every parent
Well,
really
right now the
needs
question
to
is
pay
about you. I
attention
want to hear
to.
from you, the
And if
superpower
you're
that
looking-
you would like to have, because I think we're always interested. That's amazing. Okay.
That's the one I'd like to have.
That makes a lot of
Is the
sense.
one to be able to use AI to forecast
That's perfect.
what's coming down the pipe. That's because
Amazing.
that's
okay. Well,
really
Doug,
the key
thank you
thing
so
right
much
now.
for your interview today, and hopefully we get a chance to continue this conversation soon.
Let's do it again. And thank you again for covering this really important topic and getting this information.
Hey again. I hope you were able to learn as much as I did today. Thank you so much for staying to the end and listening to the entire interview. Please feel free to leave a comment wherever you listen to this podcast. All comments will be read weekly, and we appreciate all feedback and ideas. If you have an idea for a guest or a specific topic, please feel free to share. Additionally, you can contact us at parentingiseasypodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's parentingiseasypodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for joining today, and remember, parenting is a journey. Don't forget to enjoy it. The goal is to be a little better today than yesterday, and hopefully better tomorrow than we were today.